In this video, we're going to talk about the physiology of respiration. But first, let's briefly review the respiratory system, which was covered in the previous video. So it is made up of the nasal cavity, where the air enters unless you're breathing in through your mouth, the pharynx with the three different parts, naso, oro, laryngopharynx, your larynx, trachea, and then that splits into the two right and left primary bronchi, which then enter your lungs and branch into smaller and smaller branches that you see in this next slide. Here's the bronchial tree. So the air comes down through smaller and smaller branches and then eventually ends up in these small sacs called alveoli. That's the end of your respiratory tract. That's where the oxygen ends up. On the right, you see a microscopic view of alveoli. They look like little white bubbles. You'll be looking at those in the lab review section. So those are the little air sacs, and the alveoli are where gas exchange occurs. So in this picture, we see an alveolus. Alveoli is the plural of alveolus. So the air is in here. And then nearby are going to be pulmonary capillaries. So here's one that I'm circling with my cursor. This is a capillary, a pulmonary capillary. So look at this barrier in between. This is the respiratory membrane, it's called. Make sure you know it. It's definitely going to be something you'll be asked about. The respiratory membrane is it needs to be thin because oxygen needs to pass from the alveolus into your pulmonary capillaries, and then at the same time carbon dioxide needs to move in the other direction. So you can't have, many layers. So it's going to be thin, and what is thinner than simple squamous epithelium? Nothing. So the pulmonary capillary, you already learned, is simple squamous epithelium called the endothelium. And then this white or this blue stuff in here is connective tissue. So there's a lot of extracellular matrix, so that doesn't count as a cell barrier. And then over here, the alveolar wall is simple squamous epithelium. They call it a type 1 alveolar cell, but it's simple squamous. Now there are a few type 2 cells in here somewhere that make here's one that make this stuff called surfactant that lines the inside of your alveolus and helps in gas exchange. But the type 1 cells are part of the so-called respiratory membrane. So notice it's a 2-cell barrier. Pulmonary capillary wall and the type 1 alveolar cells with the little bit of basement membrane in between. Here's an enlargement of it. And that's the 2-cell barrier. This is a theme you're going to see in the rest of the course, where you'll see it again in the digestive system for absorbing food from your digestive tract. You'll see it in the kidney for cleaning up the blood as the blood goes through your kidney into your kidney tubules. You see it in the respiratory or the reproductive system. For example, exchange between fetus and mother through the placenta. So it's something you'll see over and over again, this idea of a 2-cell barrier when you want to move things from one compartment into another. So that's the respiratory tract. Now, as far as the physiology of it goes, respiration is, we're going to talk about at least the first 3, not much about the last one, but let's just skip down to this last one for a minute. Cellular respiration is the whole reason we have to breathe. We need oxygen to completely oxidize nutrients like glucose or amino acids or fatty acids into carbon dioxide, water, and we do it to make ATP. That's cellular respiration. So you cover that in general biology. That's what's going on inside your cells. They need oxygen for it. So really, respiration is all about bringing oxygen to your cells. So we're mainly going to focus on the first three steps of respiration. Ventilation first, how you breathe in and out, bring air in and then remove old air from your lungs over and over. And then external and internal respiration, we'll go over, that refers to the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between your blood and your cells and your alveoli. So let's start with ventilation. There's three main things that we need to go over before you're in a position to really understand how we inhale and exhale oxygen, or sometimes I call it inspiration and expiration. So one of them has to do with this pleural cavity here. So you see this space in here, this cavity between your lungs and your thoracic cavity wall. That's the pleural cavity. And on either side of it are serous membranes. The visceral serous membrane, or it's called visceral pleura, and the parietal serous membrane, or the parietal pleura. I think this was touched on in the last video. And in this space is the pleural serous fluid, this slimy, viscous, lubricating fluid. No air. No air in here. So I'm mentioning this again because it has a big role in breathing. Because the two pleural membranes it's almost as if they're glued together. They stay together unless you let air in this space. So the lungs, in other words, are held against the thoracic cavity wall by the two pleura, visceral and parietal pleura. And if either membrane is ruptured or breached, like from a stab wound, say, or an infection, and air gets in here, then the lung will no longer be held against the thoracic cavity wall, and it will collapse, as you see in this picture. This is called a pneumothorax. I'm not going to try to spell it for you, but it starts with a P. So you see the lung collapsed here. So that's one important part of respiration, of ventilation, is that the lungs are held against the thoracic cavity wall. Okay, another important factor to look at is the relationship between the volume of the container that a gas is in, or in this case we're talking about air, and the pressure of it. So there is a relationship between volume and pressure in a gas. It's called Boyle's law. It's not so much we need to talk about Boyle, but the law we need to talk about, and that is that if you look at this picture, if you have the same number of gas molecules in these two different situations here, say this is oxygen, or it could be oxygen and CO2 and nitrogen. Most of our atmosphere is nitrogen, actually, N2. Anyway, whatever the gas molecules are, if you have the same number, then if you give them a bigger container, in other words, if the volume of their container is bigger, then there's not going to be as much pressure. You can visualize pressure as these little gas molecules bumping into each other or pressing against the sides of the container that they're in. So that would be pressure. And it's in this picture, it's measured in atmospheres, but in most, including our textbook, they use also millimeters of mercury, the same unit we use for blood pressure. So anyway, so the volume is larger on this side. If you look over here on the other side, they've made the volume smaller. So now the volume is decreased, and notice that that makes the pressure go up. So again, same number of gas molecules, but now they have less space to move around in. They're pushing against the wall of their container with more force, hence greater pressure. So the takeaway here is that there is an inverse relationship between volume and pressure for gases. If you increase the volume, you decrease the pressure. If you decrease the volume, you increase the pressure. Temperature can also have an effect on pressure of a gas. As you raise the temperature, the pressure goes up. But we're not going to worry about that because we don't use that for breathing. We don't like heat up and cool off every time we want to breathe in and out. But we do use volume changes, as we'll see in a moment. So that was the second important thing to note, this relationship between volume and pressure of gases. And then the third thing, and this should be no surprise, air moves down a pressure gradient. So you've seen this with diffusion, solids move down a pressure gradient. We saw it with blood. Blood moves down a blood pressure gradient. Things move down a temperature gradient from hotter to cooler, and so on. So this is another important factor to remember, that air, if you want to move air down into your lungs, then the pressure outside, we call that atmospheric pressure. That's the pressure surrounding us. That's like the envelope of atmosphere surrounding our planet is pushing down on us. And in most books, they use the atmospheric pressure at sea level, which is 760 millimeters of mercury. So that's what you're going to see in most of the books that you read, and also in an upcoming slide. So anyway, atmospheric pressure, the pressure outside, needs to be higher than the pressure in your little alveoli, or they also call it intrapulmonary pressure, inside your lungs pressure. I kind of like alveolar pressure better because that's really where we're talking about, the alveoli. So you need a gradient for air to move in. It's always going to move from higher to lower, like a wagon, top of the hill to bottom of the hill. It's going to roll. So that's for inhalation. The pressure outside has to be greater than the pressure inside your lungs. Now what about if you want to breathe out? Then your alveolar pressure has to be greater than your atmospheric pressure, so that the air, because air always moves down a pressure gradient. So it's the alveolar pressure we change, because we can't be changing the atmospheric pressure around us, but we can change the pressure in our alveoli. Okay, so now that we've gone through those things, we're ready to understand ventilation. So look at this picture. It's not great, but it shows the main thing I'm trying to show. And this is that we accomplish ventilation of our lungs by changing the volume of our thoracic cavity. You can make it bigger, you can make it smaller, the volume of your thoracic cavity. So how do we do it? Muscle contraction. And the main muscle, not the only one, but the main one is your diaphragm muscle. That's that big muscle that stretches across your ventral body cavity, separating the thoracic cavity above from the abdominopelvic cavity below. And it's a skeletal muscle, and when it's relaxed, it's dome-shaped, like this upper solid line. It's shaped kind of like an upside-down bowl. And when you contract your skeletal muscle, it flattens. See, it comes down to this dotted line. It flattens a bit. And notice this space in here that my cursor is going around in is, notice that space is now up in the thoracic cavity. In other words, by contracting your diaphragm, you have increased the volume of your thoracic cavity. Okay, now this is where the pleura become important, because remember I said that your lungs are stuck to the thoracic cavity wall. So when you make your thoracic cavity bigger, your lungs go with it. They're sort of stretched. And those elastic fibers in your lungs, in the connective tissue between the bronchial tree branch and your blood vessels, is really important, because it allows you to kind of stretch your lungs. And when this happens, your little alveoli get stretched as well. So the volume goes up. Also, there's another pair of muscles that are set, not pair, of muscles that are important. They're between your ribs, called the external intercostals, and they also contract during inhalation, when you want to inhale, and in this case, they make your ribs move up and out, sort of like these handles here on a bucket. So these are the two main inspiratory muscles, your diaphragm and your external intercostals. And so you contract them, both sets. You contract all of these whenever you want to inhale. So once again, this makes your thoracic cavity bigger, the volume bigger, and thus the alveolar volume gets bigger, and then that makes your alveolar pressure go down. So I recommend you study this picture, make sure you understand it. Let's start over here for a minute. Let's start with when you're not breathing. You're not breathing in and you're not breathing out. In between breaths, look at the atmospheric pressure, 760 millimeters of mercury. Look at the alveolar pressure, same. Right? There's no gradient, therefore there's no net movement of air into or out of your lungs. We're going to disregard the intrapleural pressure in the pleural cavity, but they do have it in here as well. But the two ends of the gradient we want to look at are the atmospheric and the alveolar pressure. So they're the same at rest. For inhalation, you contract your diaphragm, see how it flattened, making the thoracic cavity volume go up. That makes the alveolar pressure go down. See, it's gone down a couple millimeters of mercury. And now, the atmospheric pressure is not going to change. And now there's a gradient. They're not the same. There's a gradient, and air always moves from higher to lower, so it's going to move in. Until when? Until they're equal again. And there's no gradient. Just like a wagon's going to roll down the hill until it reaches level ground. Notice it's not a huge difference in pressure. So, these are it just seems like a minor difference, but it's enough to bring in about half a liter of air when you're breathing at rest. If you're exercising, it's going to be more. But okay, so that's for inhalation. We say that inhalation is active because it requires muscle contraction. The diaphragm and the external intercostals are going to contract. If you want to inhale a lot of air, even more than when you're at rest, you have to contract some additional muscles as well. You can look that up in your book. But just for normal at-rest inhalation, those are the two muscle groups, diaphragm and the external intercostals. Okay, so inspiration is active. Now to exhale, you want to reverse the gradient. You want your alveolar pressure to be higher than the atmospheric pressure. So see how down here during exhalation the pressure is higher than the atmospheric pressure. So air moves, as always, down its pressure gradient. But in this case, the gradient's flipped, so the air moves out. Until when? Until they're the same again. So that's exhalation. Now there is one, even though in some ways they're the exact opposites of each other, there is one big difference between normal at-rest inhalation and exhalation. Inhalation, as I just mentioned, is active. You have to contract muscles to do it. Exhalation, unless you're forcefully exhaling from your lungs, is passive. It does not require muscle contraction in order to occur. So we say that normal exhalation is passive. All you really have to do is relax your diaphragm muscle and your external intercostals. The volume of the alveoli or the thoracic cavity goes down when you do that, and when that happens, the pressure in the alveoli goes up and the air moves out. So really just by relaxing the inspiratory muscles, you alter the volume and thus pressure in your alveoli. The other thing that helps a lot is that the elastic fibers in the stroma, the background connective tissue of your lungs, they get stretched during inhalation like little rubber bands. During exhalation, they recoil, like letting the rubber bands go, and they snap back, or we call it elastic recoil properties. That also helps decrease the volume and bring about exhalation. So elastic recoil properties are important for exhaling. People that have like emphysema, that's one of the problems, is their elasticity of their lungs has decreased, and exhalation, it can become so bad that exhaling requires ATP energy, becomes active. Okay, so that's ventilation. It's all about changing the volume of your thoracic cavity and thus the pressure in your alveoli, and air will move down the gradient. Okay, now what about external and internal respiration? So for those, that's moving of oxygen and CO2 between your alveoli, your blood, and your cells. So let's look at the two big factors in this, the movement of gases across the respiratory membrane. One is, again, nothing new here, but that gases, they're talking about oxygen and CO2 in this case, gases move down their pressure gradients. So regardless of the presence of other gases. In other words, oxygen moves down its pressure gradient, and CO2 moves down its own pressure gradient, and they happen to be in opposite directions. So in other words, each component of the air is going to move down its own pressure gradient. Okay, one other thing about this is that because air is a mixture, it's not just oxygen, it's other things. In fact, 78% of it is N2 nitrogen gas, and then about 21% is oxygen, and a smaller percentage is CO2. So anyway, it's not, just one thing. So when you have a mixture of gases, then according to what they call Dalton's law, the each different component of the gas, of the mixture, is contributing only part of the pressure. In other words, if the atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury and the air is 78% nitrogen gas, then 78% of that number, 760, is due to nitrogen, and 21% of it, I didn't do the math, whatever it is due to oxygen. So when you have a mixture of gases or molecules in a gas, we talk about the contribution of each one as the partial pressure. So I hope that doesn't confuse you. It just means, so we talk about the partial pressure of oxygen and the partial pressure of CO2 just because it's a mixture. But it's the same general idea that these gases are moving, they're going to be moving down their gradients. And then the other thing that's important is that oxygen and CO2 are going to move through the respiratory membrane, not just based on their gradient. There needs to be a gradient for them to move, but also they have to be soluble in the respiratory membrane, which is coated with some liquid, surfactant and water. So they have to be able to get across that. They have to be soluble in the respiratory membrane. That's also important. So really they're both important, the gradient and their solubility. So in other words, here they have to get across this membrane. And remember I mentioned the type 2 alveolar cells kind of make this surfactant stuff that lowers the surface tension of the water that's also coating this. Okay, this is a very helpful diagram. Oop. This shows, here's external respiration up here, and here's internal respiration down here. So let's start up here in the alveoli. Okay, let's follow oxygen first. Well, actually, let me back up. Let me define for you external respiration. External respiration means the movement of oxygen and CO2 across the respiratory membrane. Specifically, oxygen moves in, out of the alveoli into your pulmonary capillaries. CO2, opposite direction. It moves out of your pulmonary capillaries into your alveoli. So then when you exhale, you get rid of it. That's how we get rid of CO2. Okay, that's called external respiration. External because the oxygen and the CO2 are either, the oxygen's coming from the outside environment and the CO2 is going into the external environment. Okay, now if I asked you to explain the movement of these gases across the respiratory membrane, the basic explanation in both cases is that each molecule is moving down its partial pressure gradient. So why is oxygen moving in the lungs? Well, look at the partial pressures. PO2, that's the partial pressure. You don't have to memorize the numbers. Just look at the gradient, though. It's 105 millimeters of mercury in the alveoli. If you look at the blood coming into the pulmonary capillaries, it's only 40. So big gradient, right? Oxygen is going to move from higher to lower, down the gradient, down, hence down its partial pressure gradient. CO2, why does it move in the opposite direction? Again, look at the gradient. The partial pressure of CO2 coming into the lungs is 45 millimeters of mercury. The partial pressure in the alveoli is only 40. So there's a gradient. And in this case, going down the gradient means going from the blood to the alveoli. So in each case, the molecules are moving down their respective partial pressure gradients. That's external respiration. It is a one-for-one exchange. For every oxygen that comes in, one CO2 moves out, which might not be readily apparent because if you look at oxygen's gradient, it's a lot bigger than CO2's. Right? CO2 is only 5 millimeters of mercury. Oxygen's 65 or something. Or I can't do math on the fly. Anyway, it's a lot bigger. So, but if you take into consideration their solubilities, CO2 is a lot more soluble in the respiratory membrane than oxygen. So it works out. One has a bigger gradient but less soluble. CO2 is a smaller gradient but it's more soluble. And so you end up with this one-to-one exchange across the respiratory membrane. Okay, so oxygen enters your blood in the pulmonary capillaries. It's transported through your blood. When it gets into your systemic capillaries, that's capillaries not in the lungs, somewhere else, like in your muscles or really anywhere else. Let's look at what happens here. This is internal respiration. Gas exchange between your systemic capillaries and your body cells, your tissue cells. So oxygen moves out of your blood into your tissue cells. CO2, where it's generated due to cellular respiration, moves out of your cells into your capillaries, systemic capillaries. Why? Same reason as we saw in internal respiration. Each gas molecule, oxygen or CO2, is moving down its own partial pressure gradient. Again, don't worry about memorizing the numbers, but look at oxygen's is 100 in the systemic capillaries. In your cells, it's only 40. So hence oxygen moves from the higher to lower, down the gradient into your cells. Your cells don't store oxygen, except muscles store a little bit, but mostly, they use it up right away. That's why there's always a gradient for oxygen to move in. It's not like they store it and then, eventually the gradient's reversed. They're just always using it up as they take it in. So oxygen moves in. Why does CO2 move out? Because as cellular respiration occurs, more and more carbon dioxide is being produced. And so the PCO2, the partial pressure CO2, is about 45 millimeters of mercury in your cells. In your systemic capillaries, it's 40. 40. So again, there's a gradient for it to move out of your cells into your capillaries. So, same answer as up here. Why do they move in the direction they do? Because they're both moving down partial pressure gradients. So you want to focus on two things here, or three: the definitions of external versus internal, which way the gases are moving across the respiratory membrane or between your systemic capillaries and cells, and then why. And the why is always the same answer. They're moving down their partial pressure gradient. So that's external and internal respiration. And then one more brief thing that I wanted to mention is how they're transported, these gases, through your blood. Actually, we already talked about oxygen when we talked about red blood cells, because that's how almost all your oxygen is transported, attached to the hemoglobin HB is hemoglobin, in your red blood cells. And then only a small percent is actually free in your plasma. That's because oxygen is hydrophobic. It's not soluble in your plasma. Now CO2, on the other hand, you need to know this, is transported in different ways. Let me start from the bottom, go up. About a quarter of it is attached to hemoglobin, not to the iron where oxygen is, to a different place on the protein of globin. But so, you know, a substantial amount is transported that way. About 7% is just free in your plasma. And then notice this one, about 70% is combined with water to make bicarbonate ions, HCO3 minus. And then when this gets to your lungs, it can go back to CO2 and water, and then you can release the CO2 across your respiratory membrane. So we'll talk more about this in a later lecture when we talk about, because this also affects your pH of your blood. So we talk about that in a later lecture. All right, well, let me know if you have any questions, and I'll be happy to answer them. Oops, almost forgot one more slide. Sorry about that. Control of respiration. Okay, so let me make this short. The main part of your brain where you control how many times you breathe in and out is the medulla of the brain. This is your main respiratory center. Say you're breathing 20 times a minute. Every 20 minutes, so that means 20 times a minute, your medulla neurons send action potentials to your diaphragm and your external intercostals to cause you to contract them and cause inhalation. So that's your primary respiratory center. Your pons has a lesser role, I would say. It mediates the smooth transition between breathing in and out, so you don't go around breathing like this, like that. You know, usually we don't even really notice that we're breathing in and out. So that's what the pons is doing. And then the hypothalamus mediates changes in breathing that accompany emotional responses. Remember from 212, the hypothalamus is involved in the limbic system, emotional responses. So like when you're surprised, you might go like that, or when you laugh, you breathe differently. So that's mediated by the hypothalamus. And then your cerebral cortex, which is way up in here, does give us some voluntary control over breathing rate. Like you can tell yourself, I'm going to breathe really fast or I'm going to breathe really slowly. So you can slow down your breathing, but it is limited. You can't say I'm never breathing again, ever, because if you tried, you would eventually pass out, faint, and your medulla would take over. So conscious control of breathing is definitely there, but it's limited. All right, well, that was the other thing I wanted to cover. So let me know again if you have any questions.